Hello and welcome to episode number 191 of the Board Game Barrage podcast. I am your host, the Orange Tank, Neilan, and with me as always, for real this time, as always, are the Red Tank and the Green Tanks, Kellen and Mark. How are you both doing?
Doing great.
When the listeners hear this episode, Neilan will have fled the bird's nest and will be spreading his wings alone at Gen Con 2021.
It's true. Someone had to hold our place at the Omni Hotel and, keep the dream alive. So that will be me. I will be in Gen Con
I want to
by
just
the time this goes out.
Congratulate you that the confidence that I can hear in your voice in that introduction is the same confidence of a baby bird about ready to fly.
Thank you. I think this week on the Board Game Barrage podcast, we are going to be zigging where everyone else zags. We are going to be looking at designers and the things that we know and love them for and the times that they've deviated from those paths. The games and the mechanics where they kind of felt like they were trying something a little bit different. That is coming up later in the show, but before we get there, let's talk about the games that we've been playing. And this week, Kellen is going to be telling us about Biosphere. I'm going to be talking about the Ratcatcher, and Mark is going to fill us all in on our play of Stephenson's Rocket. Let's kick it off with Kellen.
All right. We are going to talk about playing Biosphere, something that Neilan and I have played twice together, and Mark has tried once. This is a area control-ish majority game where you are trying to evolve your species onto the board and make sure that they survive the longest. This is a expensive, out-of-print, hard-to-get import from some other part of the world than the US of A, and it comes with 300 dice in the box, okay? If you look at a picture of this game, you're seeing dice everywhere, all over the board, in like 5 different colors, and you may be thinking, oh, I see, that dice has 3. Oh, that dice has 2. That dice is 1. You may be thinking, oh, that's how much of the population of that animal there is. Wrong. Okay. Well, then you might be thinking, okay, maybe that's how long they live, because it's a game about evolving and waxing and waning. Wrong. You would have to consult the Wheel of Life. Now, that is named in the rulebook, the Wheel of Life. Essentially, everything in the game is slowly dying, okay? If you move your animals into the desert,
Party game,
they will die at the beginning of the game. Basically, everything you do moves them one step closer to death, but it's very confusing because the value is not just 5 is the most alive and 1 is the closest to death. It depends upon a giant wheel called the Wheel of Life. What you're doing in the game is spending evolution points, and you are getting evolution points, and you're trying to acquire cards. Your species of animal has attributes like big. Actually, I can't remember that this.
large, small, general, special, I think.
That's specific.
Yeah.
Specific, right?
And you have to pay points to move those attributes towards one extreme or the other. And then you can purchase cards from a tableau and play them to increase your ability to survive in some of the environments, to increase your movement speed, to increase how much reproduction happens, or to increase how much points you get to spend in a subsequent round. This is sprawling. There is a ton going on. The entire game is driven by what is called the assignment system. Now, you may be thinking, is this an achievement system? And you would be right, but it's called an assignment. And to win the game, you must do 5 assignments of the 7. What's cool about this is that each assignment is a color, and there are, I believe, 4 different options for each assignment grid, meaning that every game is going to have pretty variable endgame conditions, which is sort of like completely dominate 5 border tiles, or have evolved your species to survive in, 4 different environment types at the second highest or the highest level, or, be in 3 savannas and 2 prairies, etc., etc. The bulk of the game is figuring out where to go, where to move. You can't directly attack other species. Unfortunately, my giraffes were getting beaten by some geckos on the board, which makes no sense, first of all. And then there is sort of a check for majority in a region. And if you have the majority in a region, you multiply and replenish the earth as the good Lord intended. And that is how you get more species on the board. But, every beginning of every turn, you must turn the wheel of life, and your animals will die. Your giraffes die. If you moved your giraffe into the desert, you pushed him one step closer to death, you got your assignment, but your giraffe is dead. That is essentially Biosphere. You may be thinking, wow, this sounds like a great game for some asymmetry, but you'd be wrong, because we had to pay for 50 dice for each player. There are 300 dice in this box. There is no MSRP for asymmetry in Biosphere. Mark and Neilan, tell me what you thought about Biosphere.
I liked it. It's strange because it has a lot of things you'd be familiar with, like buying cards from a card row, and you've got these tracks. You're trying to be more adept in certain types of biospheres. It's got like the area control. It's got a lot of things you're familiar with, but it does things in an interesting way. I mean, for example, the way the card row works, you buy a card as you normally would in a game, but in order to activate the card, you have to have your attributes just right. Like you might need to be like 4 on the large side and 2 on the general side. So there's these two, as Kellen mentioned, these two like poles that you're working on. One is small to large and one is generalized to specialized. And so you need to be at just the right combination of the two to trigger these cards. And so that's interesting. It's not like, oh, I just need to have at least this and at least that. No, you have to be exactly right. And that's a sort of a weird, interesting way to do card usage. And, even as sort of confusing as it can be, this wheel of life thing, how healthy are my creatures thing, for as weird as it is, and it takes a little time to grok it, it is interesting. It is interesting to see like, oh, okay, I've got a bunch of 3 dice here, and looking at the wheel of life, oh, these are actually pretty healthy. I can sort of count on them to be able to move around the board without dying out. So it takes a lot of these board gaming tropes and just does them in an interesting sort of way. It's got a touch of dominant species. It's got like a touch of, like a not a tableau thing, but, again, buying cards off an array. Just a lot of interesting things all cooked together in a unique way.
There's something that I really like about games that try to simulate ecosystems, and that was like the biggest appeal of like Dominant Species for me. And a game I mentioned a few months ago called God Loves Dinosaurs, kind of like this idea that you have all these animals and they're sort of like breeding and multiplying and sort of have to move across and migrate and find new lands. Like something about that is just really pleasant to me when you look at the board and you see what looks like a herd of animals, and then one of them goes off and it starts a new population somewhere else, and then the first one dies off. You're just seeing them sort of like ebb and flow across the board in a way that just feels very cool. Like almost like the time lapse of that would look awesome, I think. And it just leads to like those cool moments like you mentioned, Mark, where, okay, this herd is close to dying, so I have to do something. I either have to evolve them and inject some new life into this territory or migrate them somewhere else where they're more adapted to. And you're doing that while you're also have an eye towards the objective. So there's kind of this double play of keeping your species relevant on the board and then also trying to figure out how to utilize them best for the objectives. I think it's very, very clever. I think it's a little bit too fiddly for its own good. And I think what I mean by that is like, there's a lot of placing dice onto the board and like having to sort of determine what their lifespan is in a way that's not very intuitive by sort of referencing them against the circle of life. It just feels like it's just one step away from being something that you can look at and parse very easily and manipulate very easily. But it's definitely unlike anything I can think of. It's pretty unique.
Yeah. I just love when something feels weird or different. This one, you look at the table and you're like, I want to try that. There's dice everywhere. And there's also sadness. There's a lot of sadness. I think for me, thematically, when I realized that I needed to occupy 2 deserts and I pushed all my giraffes into those deserts, pushing them one step away from the wheel of life, I fulfilled my assignment and then all my giraffes died. And I felt bad about that for about 3 turns of Biosphere. I enjoy this. There's some rough edges. There's weirdness with the tiebreaker and this track that you invest your extra EP points into to kind of sort of function as a thing to keep everyone close as you escalate in the amount of points that you have to spend each round. I would probably not, unless you just loved everything that was just said, seek out to import this. But if you know someone that has it, I think any board gamer is going to enjoy putting this out and going, what the hell have we gotten ourselves into, and have a good time having that experience together.
Just one word to the wise, if you are looking to import this game, maybe you're looking to import it just to get 300 extra dice.
That don't have 6s on them.
They don't have 6s on them. Just be forewarned. They have 1s, 2s, 3s, 4s, and 5s all over the place, but nary a 6.
It is that weird thing as a board game podcast where it's like, no, I would love to show this to more people. And I think I probably will at conventions be like, but have you tried Biosphere? Even though, it's not going to end up on my top 50 list, and I don't want people to go out and drop whatever $100 it is to get it imported into the USA. But a very interesting one, and one that I think people would enjoy trying. And that is Biosphere.
So I've played several games at this point of the Ratcatcher. This is the title is a solo adventure game. This is recently fulfilled in Kickstarter. This is by designer Matthew Aslin of Platypus Industries, I believe a Australian publisher. I went in this pretty much blindly on the basis of the look and the aesthetic of this, and just some early buzz on like what the game was doing, and especially as someone that was eagerly looking for more solo games like during the pandemic. So I didn't have a lot of expectations, but what the Ratcatcher is a dungeon crawl-esque type game where you are moving a character through a map that you're sort of slowly uncovering and just killing a ton of rats. The thing that I think this is the most adjacent to is actually kind of something like a Zombicide, which is to say that is a lot of dice chucking, is a lot of just things coming in, spawning, appearing constantly, overwhelming you. Yes, rats, just overwhelming you, and you being on the knife edge of feeling like it's all just a little bit too much, but then just kind of stemming the tide a little bit and just continuing to move on in that way. The thing that I think is the most striking about this is it's effectively a very miniaturized version of that style of game. It has the component size of something like a tiny epic game, which is to say it's all played out with cards that are forming your map, and all the pieces are just adorably tiny. I want to say this, which is something I usually save to the end, but I do want to say this up front because I want to make sure I don't miss it. This is probably one of the best productions of a board game I've seen top to bottom in terms of what it's trying to do. It is such a beautiful production. The art on the cards is stunning. It has a very cohesive aesthetic. It has these printed wooden components for the characters and the nemesises, like 70 different like tiny rat meeples. It's just really elaborate. Beautiful box, beautiful storage trays that actually work really well in terms of usability. It's just nuts how much thought has gone into this product.
It looks like Matthew Aslin, in addition to being the designer, is the artist.
Wow, I did not know that. That is mad props to Matthew then, because that is impressive. It is a really cohesive production all the way through. The thrust of the game is that you're alternating between turns where you move, attack rats, place dice, and then the rat turns, which are entirely sort of deterministic. So going into the rat turn, you can calculate what's going to happen, where they're going to move, if they're going to be able to attack you, and so on. And what you're trying to do is collect 10 pieces of magical cheese before the rats eat 10 pieces of magical cheese. You can also lose. Mark?
Okay, sorry.
Don't stare.
It's a fight for the magical cheese?
It's a fight for the magical cheese.
Okay, right.
Because the magical cheese is corrupting these rats, Mark. They're becoming mutant rats. There is a big monster rat that is now controlling them and terrorizing this town.
So you're just trying to get the magical cheese. You're not trying to eat it.
No, you're just trying to save it. You're trying to save it because, I think actually, if we really want to go here,
we gotta
the
get
thrust
deep
of the
into
story is that the town made this magical cheese and they didn't realize its properties. Now the rats are going crazy and they call in the Ratcatcher to stop it. That's it. It's great.
Okay.
So you're going to get 10 magical cheese before the rats eat 10 magical cheese, or alternatively, if you die, you lose, or if you kill the nemesis, you win. So those are the two win conditions, the two loss conditions. That is the core loop. Move through the town, uncover new areas of the town, stop the rats from eating cheese, kill rats, and repeat. But that's kind of also just the core of the loop. There's not that much more to it than that. And I think where this gets the most disappointing is the layer that gets put on top of this that should be the appeal is some of the variability. Like there are characters, but they're only mildly asymmetric. They don't feel that distinct. And there are different rat nemesis bosses, which should be really cool. Like this made me think like of something like an Aeon's End, where every scenario is going to feel different because of the unique boss. In 5 games of playing the Ratcatcher, the boss did not spawn once before I beat the game. Now, I'm not going to say that I am the best person at games in the world, but something really felt off about the balance in this. I found once I got into the rhythm of what I was trying to do, it just felt trivial and rote, like I was just going through the motions in a way that didn't feel very interesting. Even as I increase the difficulty, there are 2 difficulty modes that the game offers. It kind of makes me question if I'm doing something wrong. I really, really don't think I am, but one fault I will say is the rulebook is not very clear on some things. I've clarified all of the things I had issues with, and I'm pretty sure I'm playing it correctly. But those 2 points, kind of the repetitious nature of it and the lack of variability and kind of what feels like balance issues to me at least, kind of disappointed me in the long run.
Is Radigan in the game?
Radigan should be in the game. The bosses do all have fun names. There's the Rat King, there's the...
Ratapus, I'm seeing.
Radagast, is that one?
No, Ratapus.
Oh, Ratapus, yeah. There are also these little minion rats, which are like little mini bosses that come out. I did see several of those, and those are cool because they also have unique little properties and things like that. There is a lot of flavor to this game, if I haven't made that clear. I also think that you will know from this description whether this game is for you, right? It was pleasant. I played 6 or 7 games of it. They take about 45 minutes each. You know, I enjoyed it enough to get that far. I'm not convinced I'm going to go back to it, but there was something about it that I wished was a little bit better to justify the production and how good it all feels and looks.
And I don't play solo games, so this question may not be helpful to anyone, but like it always seems like the scaling of the difficulty would need to be quite robust in a solo game to make it worthy of attention. Did you scale up in those 5 plays? Like you made it harder and still overcame?
So the game does not offer anything other than like 2 difficulty modes, which basically just make the beginning of the game a lot harder. But as I was sort of going into my last most recent game of it, I was thinking like, okay, I could just, because the rats get harder as they get more cheese, as they eat more cheese. So you could just like add some cheese at the start of that game to the rats, give them some more powers off the bat. I did do that for the most recent time I played, but was still able to beat it. But you could definitely like just layer on that. But that's also, to be clear, that is not suggested in the rules.
Yeah,
of the thing to do,
I don't like that kind of stuff. I mean, especially for a solo game where you're like, okay, it's too easy, I'm going to make it harder by doing this.
Yeah.
It just feels like, in my mind, it feels like you're not even really playing the game. You're just sort of like inventing this thing for your own. I mean, and I'm sure some people love that kind of thing, tinkering around with the rules and do like house ruling and stuff like that. But that just feels so unappealing to me, like having to make it harder on my own, because then it feels like victories would be hollow and
right. And I think the thing that's the most egregious is that even playing on the rule book's harder difficulty, like I said, it's just like a beginning difficulty, and once you get past that curve of the beginning, it still mellows out in a way that it never feels like things are ever unmanageable if you know what you're doing and are sticking to a specific plan. And that's kind of almost like the final nail in the coffin, right? I feel like I know what I need to do to win, so why would I play it any other way? And that's a bummer. But I think that's all I have to say about the Ratcatcher. I think definitely take a look at this. If you do like this style of move through a location, roll a ton of dice, Zombicide-esque games, I think there is something appealing here, but I don't think ultimately it's for me. That is The Ratcatcher by Platypus Industries. I was actually really bummed by this because it is really lovely. Like, as a toy, I like such a cool little thing. Mark, tell us about Stephenson's Rocket.
So, the 3 of us and our friend Dean all had a 4-person visit to the doctor's office this weekend. That's right, we played Stephenson's Rocket by the doctor, the one and only Reiner Knizia. This was...
Doctor. Like that?
No, that's always welcome. This was a game, I think, from originally 1999. It's one of his earlier big designs, but it was recently reprinted a couple years ago by Grail Games, and this was the edition that we played, the second edition. Stephenson's Rocket refers to a locomotive that was designed in the early days of the railroad industry in England, right around 1830, where the 18XX games sort of sprang from. Anyhow, so this is Knizia's sort of take on a railroad game. The board depicts England in the base game, although we played a variant that depicted China, and it is a hex board. It looks a lot like what you would expect from an 18XX game. A bunch of hexes on the board, some representing cities, some representing towns, and then a bunch of hexagonal pieces that you can lay on that depict track. And you're basically laying the track for one of 7 railroad lines that are depicted in the game. So on your turn, as is the style with most Knizia games, there are only a couple things that you have to choose from, actions you have to choose from. You get to do 2 of them, and the 3 actions are move a train, that's one thing, invest in an industry in one of the towns in the game. So all the towns in the game will have some types of industry where you can invest in, and when a train connects to the town, if you have the most cubes in that town's industry, you'll score a certain number of points. Second place will score a certain number of points. So that's invest in industry. And the third thing you can do is build a station. Building a station is sort of where there is a sort of area majority aspect to the game, where when a train is directed to a city, it will score points for as many cities or towns that it's touched. And the person who will get the most points for that is the person with the most stations that have been crossed. So on my turn, I might lay a station down and then try to get a train to go into the station, therefore giving me 1 station on that track. And as that track grows and grows and grows, if I can lay the most stations, it's going to be the most lucrative for me in terms of getting points. So again, on your turn, you're doing 2 of those 3 things. So you can, for example, invest in industry and build a station, or you can build 2 stations. The only exception is that you can't extend the same train twice. So you have to diversify if you're going to be taking 2 extend rail actions. But as is with most Knizia games, there are a couple twists. The first one is that if a train ever touches another train, that train is merged into the train it's touching. So if we direct the blue train into the green train, the blue train suddenly goes away. There will be 1 more scoring of that blue train. And then for as many shares as you have of the blue train, you'll get half as many in the green train. So for example, and I haven't spoken about how you get shares, but I'll do that in a second. But say you have 4 shares in the blue train now merges into green. We'll do a scoring for blue, and then you'll get half as many shares in the new green train as you had in the old blue train. So you'll go from 4 to 2. So you sort of get some sway in the newly created line at the cost of losing all the sway you had in the line that has disappeared. The way you get shares is that anytime you select the action to move a train, you get a share in that train. The reason that shares are important is, in addition to being part of the scoring you'll get throughout the game, you also, whenever somebody elects to do the move a train action, everybody at the table who has any shares in that train can say, you know what, you think you're moving the red train that way, but I'm going to veto it. So whenever a train is moved or proposed to be moved, everybody who has a share in that train has 1 opportunity to bid to veto that action and instead move the train wherever they want.
And so it's very easy to see how that would lead to my favorite part of the entire game, which is when only Mark and I are invested in 1 color of train, but I have way more shares than him, and he moves it, and then I just say, you may move the train there, or no, you may not move the train there, sir.
And the thing is, though, that whoever wins the veto vote loses that many shares of the train. So Kellen and I are both in the yellow train. I want to move the yellow train 1 direction. Kellen has 4 shares in yellow. I have only 2. Kellen says, you know what? I want to move it in the opposite direction. I'm going to bid 2 shares to veto. The person who wanted to move always gets the chance to make the last bid and only has to match the highest bid. So for me, the person who tried to move the train, now Kellen has put me in a spot where I can either let him move it, which obviously I don't want to do, and therefore cost him those 2 shares, or I can bid the 2 shares, which will make me win this action and move the train to where I wanted, but now I have 0 shares in the train, and sort of now the yellow train is at the whim of Kellen at the helm, which nobody wants to see.
That's a good train.
So you will be doing that until 1 of 2 conditions ends the game. When there's only 1 remaining train, in other words, the other ones have either been merged into that train or are isolated and can no longer connect to anything else. So when there's only really 1 viable train, the game will end. Or when all 60 pieces of these hex counters that you're putting out to extend the lines around the map have been used up, that will trigger the end of the game. And then the remaining trains that are left over will do 1 more scoring. And that's how Stephenson's rocket works. What did you guys think of Stephenson's Rocket?
I think it's definitely one of those games that's an enigma that everyone sort of goes, what just happened? And that's probably the closest thing to what I would say happened when we played 18 Reiner. But the thing that I felt the most was this sort of connection to acquire, where it's not just, can I make the biggest, baddest train across all the land? It's actually, can I make a bunch of chains and then ram them into the big train and profit all the way up, 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 and up. And so the game actually ended where I made my own train, rammed it into the main train, and did really good. And then Mark copied me with the exact same strategy. And as it happened, it just timed out really well for him, and he ended up getting a bunch of points in final scoring when it was the only train left and sneaking out the win. I think in the best way possible, it is extremely agonizing to be like, should I invest in the resources that are happening? Should I extend a train, or should I put out more stations onto the board? And I think one of the interesting balance wrinkles is that the main original game board, apparently investments are a little less good, and you only really do well with that strategy if you do it by yourself, which is why we played with the China map, which was attempted to make a sort of more balanced game. I would say that above any game I've played in the last year, it was like I literally have no idea what I want to do on my turn, and I'm in pain almost the entire time.
Yeah, it presents like quite a wealth of options, really, despite only having 3 actions, right? It's kind of like every turn is like, okay, well, I can only do these 3 things, but like I really don't know what the best thing for me to do is right now. And I think that the way that the spatial component multiplies that is huge, because, you know, you have 7 different train lines, and, you know, at any given point, it's like, okay, well, do I want to advance the one that everyone else is focusing on now? Do I want to start the splinter train up over here? Which is the closest train that's going to, at the point in time where it becomes relevant, be close enough to have the maximum amount of effect at the right time? Like, all of those decisions are going through your head as you're planning out your turn. And one of the beauties I love about even just something as simple as the station action, you can't place it right next to the train. So you have to place it a little bit in front of the train. So then there's this element of like, okay, I'm going to place this here with the hope that we're going to direct this towards my station rather than Mark's station. So you also have to set yourself up with enough stock to win veto power. There's just a lot of really, really fun things in there.
Yeah, Neilan is describing his strategy, which was to not help with the trains at all, and just invest in stations all across the land so that we had to go through them no matter what, because there was no direction we could go to not go through his stations.
As much as we're going to talk in a little bit about how this feels unlike a lot of Reiner's games, like you can see some of the throughput from like, it reminded me a little of like Tigris and Euphrates, of just kind of like how important the spatial thing is and how overwhelming it all feels at the start. But then you just see these little battle lines start to get drawn. It's like, okay, this is the part where I have to pay my attention to for right now. Like, it starts wide and then it just gets focused so quickly at crucial points. I thought this was really cool. I think my biggest criticism of it was I found that towards the end of the game, figuring out what to do just felt a little bit too mathy at times, where it's like, okay, these are the actions I can take, but what is really going to be the best thing for me is a pretty involved process to work through. And not that you should be working through that. And I was trying my best not to just work through exactly how many points each action would give me in the end. But it's not very easy to figure out, at least on the first play, how rewarding certain actions are going to be as the game is closing out.
Yeah, I would hope that with more plays, that sort of calculation would be a little easier to do. I feel like we were doing a little bit of grinding since it was our first play. But and that's not to say the calculations are super complex. It's just, I think with repetition, it would maybe come more easily.
I think that's definitely right.
I just love how there are 3 actions, and it just seems like for every action, there is like a counterbalance. Like you said, the way the stations work, where you can't place it right in front of a train. And so, you know, there is the allure, there is the necessity even to place these stations out because you need to have area majority. But if you do that, you are doing it at the cost of moving that train, which is what you desperately want to do, and also getting a share in that train because you want to get control of that. So it's like a sacrifice. And you know that when you put a station out, there is a lot of incentive for other people to immediately veer the train away from the station. Although there is an aspect of the game where you try to pick up passengers, and that does incentivize your opponents to move towards the station. But there's a lot to go against that. So when you do that action, you're sort of disincentivizing people from moving to your station. And in the same way, the investing in a industry, it's great. It's sort of like a way to sort of almost guarantee points because once you put a cube out there in an industry, there is some fighting over industry in each town, but you can sort of, if you wanted to control industry in town, you could, but you're doing that at the sacrifice of participating in this board where like the bulk of the game is happening. There's just so much give and take on each of these actions.
A word of warning for would-be 18 Reiner players. I think that the auctions, and perhaps this will evolve as we play, but our auctions, I assumed that the auctions would be, I want to do a thing, and so I'm going to have to pay a little bit for it, but it pretty quickly devolved into, I'm going to force Mark to drain his shares in order to do the thing that he wants, and so it was a lot of just pretty direct, explicit, negative interaction to force other players to drain their shares. It was like, Neilan's like, I could go here or here, but if I go here, Mark is going to have to drain 2 shares. I loved that.
Yep.
But not everyone will love it because it almost didn't always feel like an auction. So, all the possibilities. It was more like Mark moves the train and now I've got to pay.
Right. So that is Stephenson's Rocket by Reiner Knizia.
Okay, before we get into the feature topic, I just wanted to reiterate that I will be at Gen Con this weekend, so I don't have any formal plans for this, but I would love to do a small little get-together with any bugbears, BGBers that are going to be at the convention over the weekend. So I think the best thing to do is, because, this is probably not going to be a big full team get together, it's just me. I would still appreciate it, still love to see you, but I'm not going to organize anything at a specific time, at least not right now. But keep your eye on the Discord channel, conventions and meetups. That is at boardgamebarrage.com/Discord. Keep your eye on that channel, and I will be posting more details about when I'm available to get a small little gathering going if you are in the Indianapolis area at Gen Con this weekend. Let's get into the feature for this week's episode, which is designers zigging where they could have zagged. Designers who have, at points in their career, chosen to go the route that is unexpected from them, whether that's in using a mechanic that you wouldn't expect from that designer or a whole game that just kind of feels very different from their repertoire. The genesis for this idea was our play of Stephenson's Rocket, which, as I mentioned earlier in the episode, while having some Knizia touches, just feels pretty unlike anything of his that we've played. Just like engaging with the train 18xx kind of, but not really theme is just not something you would have expected. And then, of course, him putting his own sort of unique spin on it just felt like something that struck us as kind of unusual for the Doctor. We've covered Stephenson's Rocket already as a good example of one of these, but what do you guys have as some other solid examples of designers that have gone their own way for a game or two?
I think maybe the biggest example of a designer successfully doing something that was sort of unusual. And I think one thing that sort of ties all these designers together, or many of them together, the ones that zig successfully, is that a lot of them do sort of dabble in a lot of different styles. And also they're very, very good designers. So whatever they're going to do is probably going to be good. But I think probably the most successful would be Vlaada Chvátil in designing Codenames. Now he did do Pictomania, which is sort of like another Zig, maybe sort of a party drawing game. But Codenames, to my knowledge, he hadn't done a word game, certainly not a very, very popular word game. And then, he comes up with this game Codenames, which is a word game which feels like, as the cliche goes, a game that you feel like you've played your whole life and it must have existed somewhere, but no. And he sort of made this like incredible design that becomes, the most popular modern board game in the last 10 years. So yeah, I think that is sort of the pinnacle of zigging and taking your designing craft and implementing it in a way that you normally haven't and coming up with something great. Vlaada is known for Through the Ages and Mage Knight and, Galaxy Trucker and Dungeon Pets and Space Alert. They mostly have this sort of whimsical feeling, but I don't think you would call any of them light.
No.
And Codenames is a game that you could play with anybody. With your parents, with anybody. Yeah.
If anything, I would say that like one of the things that I think is very typical of a lot of my favorite Vlaada games, other than Codenames, is like this sort of layered on complexity. Like he's good at distilling complexity into manageable systems. And like I would even, I think Pictomania is potentially a good counterpoint, but it's also complicated Pictionary. So it's kind of like in his wheelhouse, right?
Sure.
At least a little bit. But Codenames, you're right. There is an elegance and a simplicity to it that just doesn't feel like any of his other designs.
And so, as someone who knows the least about Vlaada Travolta, how would you say
his name?
Thank you. Is there a throughput, right, where you can look at Codenames and say, yes, this feels adjacent to that, but in a different genre?
I mean, I think you can see, and this is the most obvious one, so there's no great insight here, but I think there is something to Pictomania, because as Neilan said, it's sort of like Pictionary, and I think Codenames is sort of like Password. Codenames has sort of Password and Battleship. That's, I think, the comparison that's often made. And so there is like a gamifying refinement that I think is in both those games. I see a thread between those two the strongest.
I think what's interesting to me here, right, and just throwing in another example is one of the podcast's favorite board games is El Grande, sort of the granddaddy of them all. Wolfgang Kramer, in the area control, area majority category, also designed the party game Six Nimmt. Now, Homeboy also has some other card games like Linko that are quite good as well, so it's not completely a zig from his discography, but I kind of see El Grande has that sort of, everybody plays a card and flips and reveals them, and then that's the order in which actions are sort of taken. And that is in Six Nimmt.
Right.
It is way sillier and way dumber. I have been loving Six Nimmt on Board Game Arena. I've just been playing it back to back with people in the Discord, and just really, even in preparation for this episode, I went and looked, and I'm like, Six Nimmt? Mr.
Right.
Wolfgang Kramer did this? And El Grande? Like, how is this possible? And so I like that idea that there's sort of this flair that they have in their heavier output that they sort of like apply in a smaller setting. But I don't know that that's exactly the thing here. Wolfgang Kramer has designed many board games that I have not played, but it is really interesting when something sort of has this like small flavor of what exists in the bigger thing, but they sort of apply it in a different genre. And like, that's the cool thing, right? It's like, if we could be like, Mr. Carl Chudyk, we want you to design a true, troops on a map game. It's got to be an hour and a half long, but it's your troops on a map game. I would love to see
Absolutely.
that. You know what I mean? It's like,
for
take
sure.
your sensibilities, go forth to my favorite genre, and apply.
Although, two things. One, before we move on from Mr. Kramer, we have to bring up another zig of his, one of BGB's favorite games, at least favorite games to say, Gulo Gulo. That's another Kramer game. But also, didn't Chudyk sort of do a Troops on the Map game, The Norsemen, Rise of the Northmen, or whatever it's called?
We don't talk about that.
Yeah, I thought so.
And that's kind of, in
Sure.
the sense that there are miniatures in it. It's more of a tile laying game. But
Sure,
yes,
that's fair.
that does exist. That maybe not have been the greatest example, but there's just something like,
No, I agree with you. I agree with the premise 100%. It would be interesting to say, like, Knizia do a Troops on the Map game. Although, he has some area control stuff, but, like an out-and-out sort of.
and it's like even Strasbourg, right, which we talked about last week, was sort of even the pre-impetus for this topic, where it's a Feld game that doesn't feel that much like a Feld game. And so the question for me is, Mr. Feld, make me a card game. Boom.
Right.
That's it. Make me a card game. Doesn't have to have llamas. Could be anything. As longtime listeners of the podcast know, my favorite board game designer is Carl Chudyk, otherwise known as Classic Carl. But he has zigged, he has zagged one specific time with a game called FlowerFall. And I don't know if this was a good zig or a good zag, so this whole episode can't be full of the best zigs and zags. But FlowerFall is literally a game where you drop cards off of like a balcony, and it is sort of variable. You can choose, it could be multiple stories high, could be just your staircase, and you are playing sort of an area control-esque game where you're trying to get flowers to be next to similar colored flowers, and it's exceedingly silly. What I will say is it works better than you would expect with that description.
Okay, thank God.
Have either of you played FlowerFall?
I have not.
No.
Oh, really? I feel like this is that game, that you bring out that one time that everyone has to try because it's so stupid. And, if you want to try hard it, you can say, okay, great. It just has to be 3 feet off the table. But if you want to have a good time, you go to a tall building and you play FlowerFall. But yeah, this is long out of print, I think, from many years ago. But it's sort of like you look at the box and you're like, this says Carl Chudyk on it.
Is this true?
Yeah. And then you look at all the pictures on BGG, and there's one very prominent one with like a 4-year-old girl on it.
Yes.
Which, yes. That is a example of Carl. And again, Carl Chudyk does stay in a lane. I think probably more than many other designers who are more prolific.
Yeah, one of the designers who I wanted to talk about briefly was David Turczi, who the games that I think about when I think about David Turczi is like some of the things he's contributed to Dracarian, Anachrony, like his work with Mind Clash on these sort of like heavy thematic Euros. He was a co-designer on Tekhenu, again, very, very heavy. Even his venturing into genres that are traditionally lighter, the 2 games he's done that are roll and write adjacent, so Welcome to Dino World and Roman Roll, they are billed as heavy roll and writes. But then he comes out with something that just feels completely wild, completely silly, a cooperative real-time game called Kitchen Rush, where you are waiters and staff in a restaurant and you are doing the silliest things, moving sand timers around the board, frantically getting in each other's ways, pulling cubes out of bags, placing them on plates. It has like a very tactile, very toy-like feel to it in a way that just feels very frantic. It's fresh in a way that I was very pleasantly surprised by, but it is one of the last things I would have expected from David Turczi in that space.
Makes me want to just cite him whenever someone brings up Tekhenu, 2020's premier board game. I'd say, oh, the designer of Kitchen Rush. That's my current new plan. But it does strike me as a question, and I think I know the answer a little bit, but don't know the context. There are designers who occasionally use different names for different, like, either genres or different games that they release. Mark, can you confirm?
I am not familiar with any, but it seems like a pen name sort of thing. I'm sure that happens.
It does seem like that is probably more prominent in like author circles to sort of say, I'm a YA author and I'm an erotic romance noveler. And those would be separate names because there's no eroticism in my YA. Thank you very much.
Moving on from that.
What?
Oh, let's go to dwell on that.
Why don't you tell me about your romance novel preferences?
That's for the bonus podcast. That's for the patrons.
Okay, fair enough.
Another designer who sort of has zigged recently, although he's still zagging his heart out, is Vital Lacerda with the release of Mercado de Lisboa, which is a zig from his game Lisboa. So it's sort of like an offshoot of an earlier game of his, but much, much, much lighter. And sort of, again, an interesting taking one aspect of Lisboa and expanding it to its own game. Lacerda obviously is known for his very, very, very heavy games. His sort of clockwork, do one little action to trigger 15 different actions. Mercado de Lisboa is sort of a more standard, more conventional, abstract sort of game. I enjoyed it. Didn't knock my socks off, but it was an interesting abstract game.
Like your favorite YA novels do?
That's right. Exactly. Like my favorite erotic YA novels. It is standard and conventional. Also, it's interesting to note that Lacerda broke into the board game design industry with his creation of a map for Age of Steam. So his very first game, as far as my understanding was an Age of Steam expansion for his native country of Portugal. So I've never played it, but while Age of Steam is a heavy game, I don't think you would call Age of Steam a Lacerda game. So it's sort of interesting that he broke onto the scene doing this expansion for another non-Lacerda-esque game.
So I think that's going to do it for some examples of designers zigging that we have. But as always, we're much more interested in hearing what you have to say. So please either get onto our guild, boardgamebarrage.com/guild, or our Discord, boardgamebarrage.com/Discord, and tell us what you think your favorite examples are of designers who have sort of gone off their sort of usual path to try something a little bit different. Or what would you like to see one of your favorite designers do next? Like, what's the little niche thing that you would like to see them do that's completely different from something they've done? Actually, that's a pretty good question for the two of you. If you could pick something for a designer that you know and love, or like some specific niche type of game that you'd like to see them explore, what would you guys want to see?
I am just stuck in my brain now. I've not been listening to anything you two have been saying about this idea of a designer series of card games. So they're like, it has to be 104 cards or less. It has to be 30 minutes or less. and we get every heavy game designer, and we sign
I
him
love
up
this.
for one Kickstarter collection. We call it BGB Zigzag or whatever. And it's
Love
like
it.
Mr. Lacerda's card game, Uwe Rosenberg's card game, Vlada Chvaltel's card game, Martin Wallace's card game, whoever designed 18XX. Get them too. And then it's
Francis
one big...
Tresham has died a couple years ago, so might be hard.
Bring him back.
Yeah, this is... That'll be the Kickstarter bonus. And I'm just obsessed with this idea. I would love to sit down and do this and just play them back to back and like see their sensibilities distilled down.
I honestly
Wow.
think this is a great idea. Like if there was a designer series where heavy designers just made a game under those specifications, I would like, I don't back things on Kickstarter. That would be instant back for me. That's so interesting. For me, I would like to see the Splotter guys do a dudes on the map game.
Oh, that's
Like just
cool.
do a crazy dudes on the map game, because they actually have done an 18xx game which I've never played called I think UR 18xx or 18xx or something like that. Something like
Title's great if that's
Yeah.
what it is. I'm very proud.
that. Most of their games lean economic, but they did the weird roads and boats. They do like a lot of weird games. I would just love to have them do like a Cthulhu Wars-esque asymmetrical dudes on a map game, because I just think it would be crazy.
Yeah, that sounds like an awesome idea. I'd love to see that. That is going to do it for this week's episode.
What about you?
God, I wasn't thinking about this at all.
Trying to get out of this. Cheater.
I thought he had already shared one because remember I wasn't listening.
Oh yeah, no. He's doing the same thing now that he was doing with Biosphere. He's trying to cheat.
Yes. That
Yeah,
is a thing I
Trying to
do.
get out of it.
a cheater. You knew what majority meant when it said majority in the rule book.
I don't know. I kind of, bouncing off Kellen's idea, I like the idea of just adding arbitrary constraints to a design and, kind of that game jam idea of just saying like, okay, here's what you have to work with, go. And for whatever reason, like the one thing I'm thinking of now, just because of the Terzi example, is using real time in a creative way, because I was always super interested in like, in fact, this is actually something I could have mentioned earlier, like Eric Lang's XCOM is a cooperative game with a real-time component, which is not something I believe I've seen him explore again. And I thought that was extremely interesting. And just that constraint, like the ideas that spring out of that with stuff like Project Elite and Pendulum, I think is always like interesting when you're forced to work under those conditions. They don't always
That would be
succeed,
cool.
but I would be curious to see what people did with it.
Lacerda real time.
Yeah. What would that look like? That would be wild.
It'd be like gears. You just like gotta put out a gear, gotta get all the gears moving.
Yes. And then you're just rotating gears like to operate this absurd machine. I love it.
You call it the Watchmaker. The Watchmaker, that would sell. If Lacerda came out with a game tomorrow called The Watchmaker, people would buy it instantly.
Slap a steampunk theme on it. It sells itself.
Oof. Well.
That is going to do it for this week's episode of the podcast. Thank you all so much for listening. You can reach out to us via email at boardgamebarrage@gmail.com or come chat to us on Discord, boardgamebarrage.com/Discord, or on any other social media you like. We are on Instagram. We are on Facebook. We are on Twitter. Just search for us and you will find us. Thank you, as always, to Heart Society for our intro and outro music. What's in Your Mind, Kid? And goodbye to the two of you. I will see you both next week.
Have fun in Gen Con.
Thank
See
you.
you all later. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Au revoir, Shoshana.
Together, the ones that sort of zig, the ones that sort of zig successfully.